Linda had always hated me, but what she announced at Thanksgiving dinner changed everything I thought I knew about my husband's family and my own past. The turkey was getting cold on my plate as Linda's words echoed in the dining room. Everyone was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, and honestly, I felt like I had. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of Linda's icy stares and backhanded comments, and now this bombshell that made my stomach churn worse than morning sickness ever could. I'd always wondered why she seemed to look right through me, like I was some kind of ghost haunting her perfect family gatherings. Every holiday, every birthday, every casual Sunday dinner, she'd find ways to make me feel like an outsider. The way she'd reorganize the kitchen after I'd helped with cooking, or how she'd tell stories about the family that somehow never included space for me to contribute. I thought it was just typical mother-in-law stuff, the kind of thing my girlfriends complained about over wine and takeout. But sitting there, watching her face crumble as she confessed that she was my birth mother, everything started clicking into place in the most horrible way possible. The weird looks, the way she'd sometimes catch herself staring at my hands or the birthmark on my wrist. How she knew exactly how I liked my coffee without ever asking. The strange mix of familiarity and distance that had always made family gatherings feel like walking on eggshells. My husband just sat there, fork halfway to his mouth, acting like he was hearing this for the first time. The performance was almost convincing, but I'd lived with this man for 3 years. I knew his tells. The way his left eye twitched when he was nervous, how he'd press his lips together when he was concentrating on keeping a secret. All those little signs were flashing like warning lights, but my brain was too overwhelmed to process what they meant. The weeks that followed were a blur of awkward phone calls and even more awkward family dinners. Linda kept trying to bridge the gap between us, sharing stories about her pregnancy, about the family she'd been too young and scared to build. She'd pull out photo albums and point to pictures of herself at my age, showing me similarities I'd never noticed before. The shape of our noses, the way we both twisted our hair when we were thinking, how we both had this habit of humming while doing dishes. It should have been beautiful, this reunion she'd apparently dreamed about for 28 years. But every conversation felt forced, like we were both reading from scripts neither of us had memorized properly. She'd overshare details about her life back then, about the guy who'd gotten her pregnant and disappeared, about how she'd held me for exactly 47 minutes before the social worker took me away. I'd nod and make appropriate sounds, but inside I felt nothing but this weird numbness. My husband kept pushing for us to spend more time together, suggesting mother-daughter activities like shopping trips and spa days. He'd get this excited look in his eyes whenever Linda and I managed to have a civil conversation, like he was watching his favorite movie play out in real life. The whole thing felt performative, like I was an actor in some reunion show he'd been directing from behind the scenes. The adoption agency records took forever to get unsealed, but when they finally arrived, they confirmed what Linda had told us. Everything matched up perfectly, dates, hospital information, even the small details about the blanket I'd been wrapped in. Reading through those papers felt like looking at someone else's life, even though it was technically mine. The clinical language made it all seem so cold and procedural, nothing like the emotional reunion everyone seemed to expect me to be grateful for. Update 1. Things got complicated when I started asking questions about the timing. Something was bothering me about how perfectly everything had lined up, how my husband had just happened to find me in a city of millions and fall head over heels. When you've been lied to about something this big, you start questioning everything, even the stuff that should be romantic. I did some digging through old social media posts, looked back at how we'd actually met. He'd always told me it was pure chance, that he'd seen me at that coffee shop and couldn't resist striking up a conversation. But when I really thought about it, that coffee shop wasn't anywhere near his usual hangouts. It was practically across town from where he worked, in a neighborhood he had no reason to be in. The more I investigated, the weirder things got. I found out he'd been asking around about adoption agencies in the area months before we met. His search history on our shared computer, which I'd never paid attention to before, was full of searches about reunion stories and adoption records. He'd even joined some online forums for adoptees and birth parents, lurking and reading stories about successful reunions. The breaking point came when I found a folder on his laptop labeled Research. Inside were screenshots of my social media profiles going back years, way before we'd ever met. Pictures of me at college graduation, at friends' weddings, even some random photos from nights out that I'd forgotten I'd posted. He'd been watching my life like some kind of documentary, collecting information about me before he ever introduced himself. But the worst part was the document I found buried in that same folder. It was like a relationship strategy guide he'd written for himself, outlining how to approach me, what interests we supposedly had in common, even conversation starters based on things he'd learned from stalking my online presence. Reading it felt like discovering that your entire love story was actually just someone else's elaborate project. When I confronted him, he broke down completely. The whole story came pouring out like he'd been waiting years to confess. He told me how Linda had never gotten over giving me up, how she'd talk about her lost daughter during family dinners, wondering what I looked like, what kind of person I'd become. He'd grown up hearing these stories, watching his mother carry the sadness that nothing else seemed to fix. He'd started looking for me as a surprise, thinking maybe he could arrange some kind of reunion as a gift for her birthday or Christmas. But when he found me, when he saw my pictures and learned about my life, he became obsessed with the idea of being the one to bring us together. He convinced himself that the best way to make it happen was to become part of my life first, to create a situation where the reunion would be natural and beautiful instead of forced and awkward. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. He crafted our entire relationship around this fantasy of being the hero who healed his mother's broken heart. Every date, every milestone, every moment I thought was genuine had been calculated to serve this larger purpose. Even our wedding day had been part of his master plan, though he'd apparently chickened out about revealing the truth then and decided to wait for the perfect moment. Update 2. The family dynamics exploded after I confronted him. Linda was horrified when she learned what her son had done, but she was also defensive about her own role in the situation. She kept insisting that she'd had no idea about his plans, that she'd been just as shocked as everyone else at that Thanksgiving dinner. But I started remembering little comments she'd made over the years, ways she'd seemed to know things about my preferences that I'd never told her. His father and siblings were split down the middle. Some of them thought what he'd done was romantic in a twisted way, like he'd just been trying to help his mother heal from an old wound. Others were completely disgusted by the manipulation and deception. Family gatherings became these tense affairs where people would choose sides, whispering in corners about whether I should forgive him or run for the hills. The worst part was how everyone kept expecting me to have feelings about Linda that I just didn't have. She was my biological mother, sure, but she was also a stranger who'd been cold to me for years. I couldn't just flip a switch and suddenly feel maternal love or gratitude or whatever emotion everyone thought was appropriate. She'd try to touch my arm during conversations or bring up childhood memories that obviously weren't mine, and I'd just feel uncomfortable and fake. My husband kept begging for forgiveness, saying he'd only wanted to make everyone happy. He'd leave flowers on my car at work, send long emails about how sorry he was, even showed up at my sister's house trying to get her to convince me to come home. The desperation was almost as unsettling as the original deception. This was a man who'd spent months researching my life before we met, and now he was acting like he couldn't understand why I might need space to process everything. I started staying with friends, trying to figure out what I actually wanted instead of what everyone else thought I should want. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering if any of my feelings for him had been real or if I'd just been responding to his performance of the perfect boyfriend. How do you separate genuine attraction from manipulation when the manipulation was so complete? The legal stuff was complicated too. We owned a house together, had joint bank accounts, shared credit cards. Untangling a marriage is messy under normal circumstances, but when you add in the fact that your husband basically catfished you in real life, it becomes this whole other level of complicated. I had to get lawyers involved just to protect myself financially while I figured out what came next. Linda kept reaching out, wanting to build a relationship separate from whatever happened with my marriage. She'd send texts about wanting to know me as a person, not just as the daughter she'd given up. But every interaction felt tainted by the circumstances of how we'd reconnected. How do you build trust with someone when the foundation of your relationship is based on lies, even if they weren't her lies? Final update. 6 months later, I finally understood what I needed to do. The clarity came during a random Tuesday morning when I was having coffee alone, something I'd started doing to reclaim spaces that felt like mine. I realized I'd been trying to fix something that was fundamentally broken from the start, trying to salvage relationships that had been built on deception. I filed for divorce and meant it this time. Not because I didn't love him, but because I couldn't trust my own feelings anymore. Every memory we'd shared was contaminated by the knowledge that he'd orchestrated our meeting. Our first kiss, our first fight, the night he proposed, none of it belonged to me the way I thought it did. He'd stolen my agency in my own love story, and I couldn't forgive that. Linda took the divorce harder than I expected. She kept saying I was throwing away our chance to be a real family, that we could work through this together. But I finally told her the truth, that being related by blood didn't automatically create a relationship and that 3 years of coldness couldn't be erased by one dramatic revelation. I needed to discover who I was outside of other people's expectations and fantasies. The paperwork took months to finalize, but the emotional work took even longer. I had to learn how to trust my own instincts again, how to believe that my feelings and reactions were valid even when other people disagreed with them. I started making decisions based on what felt right to me, not what would make the best story or create the happiest ending for everyone else. I moved across the country for a fresh start, somewhere nobody knew about my complicated family situation or my failed marriage. I got a small apartment with a garden where I could grow tomatoes and herbs, things that were entirely mine from seed to harvest. I adopted a cat who chose me at the shelter, creating the first genuine relationship I'd had in years that wasn't built on hidden agendas. Linda and I exchange emails occasionally now, careful messages about weather and work that don't dig too deep into the past or future. She respects my boundaries better than she used to, though I can tell she's still hoping for more. Maybe someday we'll have the relationship she dreamed about, but it'll have to be on terms that work for both of us, not just her fantasies. My ex-husband tried to contact me for the first year after I moved, sending letters to my old friends and even hiring someone to find my new address. But eventually he stopped, maybe finally understanding that some damage can't be undone with apologies and flowers. I heard through mutual friends that he moved back in with his parents and started seeing someone new, hopefully someone he met honestly this time. The strangest part of the whole experience was realizing that I'd been grieving the wrong things. I thought I was mourning the loss of my marriage and my mother-in-law relationship, but what I was really mourning was the loss of my own narrative. I'd let other people write the story of my life, and when I took that power back, everything else became clearer. I still think about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes, how different my life might have been if Linda had kept her secret or if my husband had been honest from the beginning. But I've stopped wondering about alternate timelines and started focusing on the life I'm actually living. It's messier and lonelier than the fairy tale reunion everyone wanted, but it's genuinely mine in a way that nothing in my marriage ever was. The hardest lesson was learning that some revelations don't set you free, they just show you how trapped you've been all along. But recognizing the cage is the first step toward finding the door, and I finally found mine on a random Tuesday morning over coffee in a life that belongs completely to me.